Hi everyone, Father Alex here. I'm the Vicar of St Matthew's Church in Burnley. I'm also the host of the Godcast, which hopefully you're going to watch now. I'm also the author of Our Daily Bread, Argos to the Altar, Priest Story, which is out now, so go check that out. I do hope you enjoy this interview that's coming up now with Luke Larner, who is a priest specialising in practical theology. And this conversation focuses on the issue of class between the church and the challenges and the compromises that brings to us in the Church of England. If you enjoy this video, do check out others, or perhaps subscribe down in the bottom right-hand corner. There are over 140 interviews now, I think, of Godcast guests, so plenty to look at and something for everyone. So thanks for watching, and hope you enjoy this interview now with Luke Larner. Well, I'm delighted to say that joining us on the Godcast this week is Father Luke Larner. Now, Father Luke is based down in Luton or Bedfordshire, and he is a priest, but he's also a bit of an expert in practical theology. And we're going to talk to Luke a bit about his own career, but also about some of the issues that are around the church, particularly around class and structures. So, Luke, it's brilliant to get you on. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Alex. It's good to talk to you. I remember seeing the that famous bit of footage on the telly with you in a couple of years ago, and I remember well the major impact that had on my training incumbent at the time. I was a curate then, and it really helped our local parish church to start grappling properly with what role we might play back then. So yeah, it's really good to talk to you.
Yeah, that's very, very kind of you, Luke. But just quickly touch on that, rather than be about me. What do you think it was about that film that had such an impact?
I think it just exposed people to the realities of life that many people in our society are facing. And I don't know why. I think it's partly testament to the filmmaking and partly testament to the people that they spoke to. Somehow it really captured people. I think they really did a good job of making it capture people. And if I remember correctly, my training incumbent's words were something along the lines of, how could we not get involved in social justice after seeing that? How could I not realise it's part of my duty as a parish priest and for us as a congregation? So it really nailed it home for people. I think it really shocked people in a good way.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. You will be known to many people, but there'll be many people out there who are unfamiliar. Just tell us a bit about your context to becoming a priest. I mean, you were a bricklayer, Luke, weren't you?
Yeah, I was a brickie for 10 years. So I was self-employed, ran a little building firm, used to have other subbies that worked for me, mostly in the domestic area. So we built extensions on people's houses, that kind of work. So I worked with my hands right up until end of 2014. So it's a long and winding story, but essentially although church, I've sort of been on the periphery of church for most of my life. I came to a faith of my own when I was 16. And some years after that, I'd always had a difficult relationship with church. So I was in this little Anglican church plant that met in a school where I grew up in Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire, which is a little market town sort of place, little rough and ready market town. And we had a really good youth worker at that Anglican church plant. He and his wife were former missionaries, and they had a very vital faith, which attracted me a lot as a gobby working class teenager. And the other thing about them was they really took risks on us as young people and invested into us and saw that we had something to contribute to the church, which for me and some of my quite leery mates, they were pretty courageous in this wee little Anglican plant, letting us preach and lead worship and all sorts of things. So fast forward in some years, I'd sort of fallen out with church, and I hadn't lost my faith, but I never felt like I fitted in. I couldn't understand why it seemed so much easier for other people to engage with church than it did for me. and I'd sort of explored some sort of call into a ministry. I'd been involved in youth work for a bit, but it never worked out, and I kept falling out with pastors and things like that. I ended up many years later, while I was laying bricks, joining a Christian motorcycle club because I was mad into motorbikes. And I went to meet up with these guys from this motorcycle club down at the Ace Cafe on the North Circular in London. And I mean, a couple of things happened. Firstly, it's the first time I've been in a Christian group where I didn't look considerably more rough than everybody else. One of them used to say he sort of thought I was a bit middle class. A guy called Rocky, dear friend, he lovely bloke. He's a truck driver. But secondly, I realised this was an environment where I could be a Christian and not have to pretend to be anybody other than who I was. Not have to pretend that I'm not a bit rough around the edges and okay, I swear a bit too much, and the kind of banter and the kind of way of being between people in environments like building sites and others, and in motorcycle clubs. And these were men and women who had a very real faith, but who in many cases came from the wrong side of the tracks. And one of the people in that club, a chap called Sean Stillman, was a minister, and he runs an incredible thing, or helps run an incredible project called Zach's Place in Swansea, and it's a little old gospel chapel. And the congregation of that chapel is made up mostly of bikers, people experiencing homelessness, and artists. So you go to a sort of midweek service or Bible study there, and it's this beautiful chaos of people whose lives are very chaotic, but it is really an incredible thing. And me and my wife were really captured by this experience of meeting Sean and going to this place. My wife's a barber by trade. She didn't get any GCSEs. She just recently got her first GCSE last year, near the age of 40, and she's one of 7 kids, and she's the only one that's got one, as far as I know.
Yeah.
So when you talk about we were talking before we started about the report that came out from the Church of England. You kind of get these funny things of people whose mum and dad went to Cambridge, and they're like, "Oh, well, I'm very working class," and I'm like, "We're not quite talking about the same thing here, are we?" Because you had like a second-hand Sierra or whatever, you're working class.
And you talk about your working class kind of upbringing. Just describe that for us. What was it like?
Do you know what? I mean, in my younger years, I didn't go without. We had a relatively comfortable life, my family, by the time I was born. My dad came from a very, very working class family, in a council house, struggling to get by. My mum's family story is quite interesting. So her family, going back a few generations, was actually sort of reasonably well-to-do and fairly wealthy, I think. I can't remember how many generations it was. It was like maybe 3 or 4, something like that. But one of her like great-grandparents or whatever married a common girl, and was disinherited from his family, never spoke to him again. So he ended up being quite poor. So my mum's family were I would probably describe as sort of aspirational working class, maybe even to sort of lower middle class. But my mum left school and started training to be a nurse, but didn't finish it. So neither of my parents had a university education. Neither of them. I think my dad was only about 14 when he left school. He worked as a printer's apprentice. But they'd both done okay, particularly my dad. He's a real old, he'd become a salesman by the time I was born, and he's a bit of a hustler, my dad. So he was doing all right for himself. We had a little wimpy house and a decent company car. But then when my parents broke up and my dad's company went down the toilet, that was when I was about 14. Because of not having that safety net that comes with sort of family wealth, I'm not even talking wealth, I'm talking about just not being poor. Yeah. We just lost everything. So me and my dad ended up close to homelessness, had to get a council flat, and the council were really unhelpful in trying to get us housed. And so then we really experienced, life was pretty tough for a few years then. I've had periods of my life where I've lived several periods where I've lived below the poverty line, where I've lost weight due to being hungry. So I have experienced quite a mixed life. I mean, especially now being an Anglican priest, right? I live in a house I never dreamed I'd be able to live in now. I can't afford to heat it, but because I'm only on half a stipend.
Ditto, brother, ditto.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm sat in the corner of it, yeah, no heating on, but yeah,
Yeah, well,
I know what you mean.
yeah, we can afford slightly better weather down here in Luton, but not by much. Yeah, it
So
does
how
very
does
much feel like a northern town stuck in Bedfordshire, Luton, in
yeah.
a funny sort of way, post-industrial town.
So how does all this materialize into a calling to the priesthood, and
Yes.
and your how did your background make that pathway? You know, I mean, mine was quite
Mm,
difficult. I
mm.
worked in a shop all my life, and I was like, and it was troublesome, which I talk about in my own book. But what about
Yeah.
you? What was it like for you?
So I'll carry on briefly where I left off and fast forward. So my mate Sean, that was doing this interesting stuff, said to me, "Have you?" First of all, he said, "Have you ever thought about doing theological education? Because you're obviously very interested." I used to enjoy reading theology and thinking about it and talking about it. And I said to him, "Well, no, I haven't. I never. You know, how am I going to afford to do that?" And he encouraged me to give it a go, and we got a bit of help from our local church, which had a bit of money. And I started studying part-time, and then bit by bit I gave up days of work doing bricklaying to do work here in Luton. So my wife was working in a charity supporting sex workers. I ended up becoming a chaplain in a homeless day centre and other things, and we lived off a sort of a pittance of support from local churches and grants and things like that. In the midst of all of this, I got to know the local diocese a bit better, and the local suffragan bishop and others, and got invited to come and give some presentations on my work and things like that, and ministry. And in the midst of all of that, my mate Father Eddie, who's a priest down in Leavesden in Watford, he's a real character. He's a lovely, lovely fella. Comes from a working class Roma family. And he took me out for a Nando's next to St Albans Cathedral after this meeting. And I'd gone to the cathedral on my motorbike in all my club colours, and it almost got sort of turned away at the door, even though I was there for a meeting with bishop staff kind of thing. But he took me out and he said, look, he asked me a few questions, and he said, look, he said, have you ever thought you might be called to be a priest? And I just laughed at him because I thought, well, yeah, right. Like, look at the priests that we know, you know, it's never going to happen. I don't have the right education background. I don't have the right family background. I'm too outspoken. You know, I look a bit rough. But he asked, can I write? I was a member of a parish that was in vacancy at the time, so we didn't have a vicar. One of the benefits of being in an area like Luton is we can't afford many clergy down here, certainly not full time. So he wrote off to the bishop, and one thing led to another, and here I am today. But like you say, it is a bumpy road, and this report that's just come out on the experiences of working class clergy in the Church of England demonstrates it's a bumpy road for people that have come from backgrounds like ours. And I would say every step of the way, so the meetings with the vocations advisor, the meetings with the director of ordinance, college, curacy, sign off, every step of the way I expected to be rejected. You know, every step of the way, I thought, well, this will be the end of the road, and goodness knows what I'm going to do now because I've got too lazy to go back to laying bricks.
But you know what, Luke? I mean, even when when you're selected, I think the pathway is not very helpful for working classes. You know, I was selected, and I just wasn't in a position to uproot my family to a college. You know, because we were reliant on my wife's salary. You know, it just wasn't practical. You know, and I ended up training regionally, which was fine and was a fun and interesting experience, not without challenges. But we don't make it easy, do we, for people who we try and help?
So to ask you a question, Alex, do you think, because it's something I've thought about, but I've not put words to really, but do you think there's something specific about the working class experience that makes it almost sort of traumatic to uproot your family like that to go off to a college? Because the idea terrified me. I don't know why. I just sort of thought, well, what if it goes wrong and I get kicked out and then I'm going to be homeless and have no job? You know,
and I think it still terrifies me. You know, I mean, I'm from Burnley. I grew up in Burnley. I work in Burnley. I'm a priest in Burnley, and the prospect that God might call me somewhere else is quite frightening, because I think if you're from the working classes, and you know, particularly if you're off the estates, you feel security about that. You know, where other people might see it as a vulnerability, I do think people on the estates feel secure where they are. You know, I do feel people that live on the housing estates or work in a bakery or in a factory, that there's something about the security of it all, isn't there? I don't know what you think.
I totally agree, and I mean I've noticed. So I was a lay minister here in Luton for a couple of years, and through my training, so I did like a context-based training, a bit like you. You know, I did a kind of regional-based thing, and
but even that's quite snobbish, isn't it? Like, you know,
well, it was.
you know,
it was
oh,
funny.
you're not. You mean you didn't do Cuddesdon, or you didn't?
Oh, yeah,
you
yeah.
know,
Well, funnily enough, I did. So I did a context-based pathway, which
Yeah.
meant I got to go off to Cuddesdon. And do you know what? In many ways, I really enjoyed it because I got to go off on like 3 weekend retreats to Cuddesdon and eat like
Yeah.
loads of food and have cheap beer in the common room and all the rest of it. And it was really quaint, this little college in the middle of nowhere. So yeah, in many regards, I enjoyed it. I wouldn't have enjoyed it residentially, and you know, that's nothing against the college. There's some lovely people there that work there, but yeah, it wouldn't have been the one for us, and particularly for the rest of my family. They wouldn't have coped at all with that environment, not at all. And so coming back here to Luton after being in Bedford, you know, I did my curacy in Bedford. And there's not many places you can come from where going to Bedford feels too middle class, right? But it did. It was a civic church, and it felt. I loved it. I loved my curacy in many, many ways, but it felt uncomfortable. The environment I was in, to me, I felt I couldn't just be myself, and so I've really noticed the difference coming back here to Luton to work in an urban parish here. I just feel at home. Even on the interview day, I met the church wardens and the people here, and I just breathed a sigh of relief. I was like, oh, this is home. These are people I understand, and they understand me.
Yeah. I think that's one of the, you know, the positives. I mean, you know, I don't just want to slag the Church of England off. I think in my context, the bishop was very accommodating, you know, and was wanting to do place me where I would feel like home, and that happened to be St Matthew's, which was fabulous. I want to ask you, Luke, how you moved. So you're ordained, but you're now, you know, a bit of an activist, aren't you, for this issue about the classes? What was it that kind of drove you to that point? What were some of the prejudices that you had seen that kind of wound you up and thought, I need to speak out about this?
It starts partly in how I was brought up. And my nan, who was the child of Irish immigrant, had this famous phrase. I don't know what your swearing policy is on this podcast, so feel free to bleep it out.
Says it is.
But my nan had this phrase she said when we were growing up, and it was, you can't stop them shitting on you, but never let them rub it in. And there was this sort of them. And I don't know if it was really couched in the language of class, but there was a them. And the them ran everything, and we didn't get a say. And there was this sort of sense of struggle, you know, and I grew up with that, and I saw that at school and elsewhere. My calling back into sort of this idea of ministry came through work here in Luton, like I say, with people experiencing homelessness, with sex workers, young lads getting groomed into criminal exploitation. And I saw how badly our society is failing people. So within the tradition of Catholic social teaching, they would sometimes talk about being evangelized by the poor. And it was through these experiences, not of just standing behind the counter at the soup kitchen and doling out soup, but making friends, getting to know people who were really on the sharp end, way worse than I'd ever experienced, you know. And they converted me to Jesus of Nazareth, this house builder living under empire, having his labor exploited. And I came to the point of realizing that if Christian faith and Jesus of Nazareth doesn't mean anything, have anything to say, or give us anything to do in this context, then it's an irrelevance. Then I'm out. I'm not interested. But I found that it did. And you know what? Part of that experience was going and doing my theological education with the Church Mission Society, which is a missions organization. And we really looked at some of the liberation theologies, these Christians and theologians and ministers who've wrestled with what it means to minister in these environments of extreme injustice and poverty. And that gave me some language, and that helped me reflect and understand. So that was a really empowering experience for me. But that is what led me into this stuff, is to say, you know, if my faith has nothing to say or do about any of this, then I'm not interested in it. If it's just pie in the sky when you die, to use the words of an old trades union song, then what is it? What is it about?
Yeah. And of course, I was recently in Sheffield for the Estates Conference, Luke, and they shared some data there, which was quite harrowing and quite shocking. You know, this gulf between what we described as a middle class, upper class, and working class. And this particular slide was regarding clergy, and you know, and I think the church wants to embrace people like you and I.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think they want to. Yeah, I do agree with that. But
it is dominated by those people who want more like us.
Yeah.
You know, so it makes it quite difficult, doesn't it? You know, and you know, I'm on General Synod, and there is nothing a more stark, clearer example of the class structure there. You know, I mean, I'm not the most confident person, so if I have a chip on my shoulder, and it's evident anyway, it's probably evident at Synod, because I do feel like a complete fish out of water. So how do we turn that structure? How do we kind of infiltrate those class structures and battles to make a difference? Because, you know, it is still very middle class, isn't it? You know, it is very still quaffing wine and nice cheeses and all that, you know.
And it goes beyond that to two things. On a sort of relational and cultural level, it is a certain way of being in the world and seeing the world. And it just isn't the way of being in the world and seeing the world that I experience, which makes, at times, the way I speak and carry myself deeply offensive. Not just on the level of accent. I mean, yeah, that's all there. But I mean, that kind of angst I was brought up with about this them is very unwelcome in the Church of England, because frankly, the Church of England is part of the them and has been. And yes, I think people like me and you are more wanted now but we weren't historically. We really weren't. Secondly, part of it for me is to say, when we start to talk about social class, we're moving beyond the realms of just identity and microaggressions and inclusion. We're moving towards the realm of assessing the material circumstances people live in. We're assessing how people are eating, what kind of building they live in, what is happening to their labour at work, or what is happening to them as part of this vast labour reserve of that are labelled with things like the underclass, or the, you know, whatever language people want to use. And as soon as you start to get into that level of material analysis of labour conditions and pay, you have to start talking about justice, not charity. And the minute you do that, you have to start not being wedded to the status quo of things as they are, but you have to have a vision of the world as it should be. And not just a vision, but some tools and ideas of how we're going to get from the world as it is to the world as it should be, preferably fairly quickly. And that is where I think the greatest barrier comes in an institution which, let's face it, the Church of England is about as stuck in the mud of the status quo as you can possibly get. There's the old phrase, isn't there? Like a mighty tortoise creeps forth the church of God, or something like that. So we are so wedded to things as they are. We're so allergic to change that the very notion of upending society to make it more just as we read in the Magnificat, which we're supposed to say or sing every night as Anglican priests. I know many of our colleagues have given up on all that. But this idea of the mighty being cast down from their thrones, the rich being sent empty away, you start talking in that language in a synod or whatever, despite it being biblical language, people start getting nervous and shuffling their feet.
Yeah, it's really true. You know, you know, some of my frustrations, Luke, come from, you know, I'm on synod, and this very real and very sensitive subject about LLF and same-sex relationships, about, you know, a minority group who are kind of seeking their place, their rightful place in the church. And you know, I'm openly an inclusive priest, but alongside that is also that pocket of working class people that are, you know, absolutely in many places kind of, I wouldn't say forgotten about, but not really getting anywhere near the attention that we should be giving them if we are to be truly Jesus kind of gospel led priests and witnesses. I wonder what you think about Bishop Phillips' position, where, you know, this distribution of wealth, where you alluded to it a few moments ago. You know, you can't afford in Luton many stipend priests, but where do we need the full-time stipend priests? In Luton. Where do we need
guess how many retired priests there are that live in my parish and come to my congregation? Wow. Not as many as in the villages, that's for sure.
Yeah.
The answer's none.
You know,
I don't know if we've got any retired priests that live in the whole deanery, actually, as far as I know. There might be somewhere, but I mean, you know, we have all these rules that come out of synod about, you know, you have to say mass every Sunday in your parish, which I wholeheartedly agree with. You can't do that here. If I go on holiday, how hard it is to get someone to come and cover, because there isn't anybody. You know, the parish I served was in vacancy for 15 months and they just had nobody most of the time.
Yeah.
So I think you get onto the redistribution of wealth. So firstly, I want to address very briefly what you said before that about the LLF stuff. Like you, I'm an inclusive priest and I agree. When we're talking about LLF, what we're talking about is inclusion, i.e. we're saying we want LGBTQ plus people to be included and participate in the church, which I wholeheartedly support. When it comes to class, I'm not sure we're talking about inclusion, because we're talking about that something needs to drastically change, because a class stratified society in my mind is not in line with the values of Jesus of Nazareth and the Christian faith. So when we talk about class, we're actually saying we want society to change, rather than just say we need a better diversity and inclusion policy. You know, and there's something by very nature of being working class, particularly those who are most excluded, whereby you don't even get to have a voice in that conversation because you're just not in the room. So, and then you start to look at that from an intersectional experience and you wonder about, well, what are the experiences of an LGBTQ person who's working class? What are the experiences of a person from a majority world heritage who's working class? Because actually a significant proportion of the working classes in this country are from majority world heritages. In the global picture, the working classes are the most diverse people group on planet Earth. So there's a complexifying needing of how we talk about these issues and who is actually in the room and gets to speak. The second side is who controls the resources, like you say. So I'm a member of Unite the Union's Faith Workers branch, and I've been doing some digging into how stipends are funded and the Church Commissioner's pot of money recently. And I'd like to see, I think a full-time stipend is a decent wage when you consider that you get a house. I mean, that's way more than I've ever earned in my life, a full-time stipend plus housing. So I don't feel that we're unfairly paid. However, if your pay is not matching inflation, you're having pay cuts. So I think at the very least, we should be making sure stipends just keep up with inflation. Now, the Church Commissioners Fund stands at about £10 billion at the moment. And the latest report says they are making about a 10% return annually on average over the last 30 years. So that's a good long length of time to work out that average. So 10% of 10 billion is £1 billion. And the cost of stipends in the Church of England, the main fund for the whole country, is 250 million, which they don't fund. So already you've got an annual income there that could fund that whole stipend cost 4 times over. Then you look at the statistics and see that £50 million of the Church Commissioners' returns each year are spent on the ministry of bishops and archbishops. So if we can afford to spend £50 million of that return on bishops and archbishops, why can't we afford to spend another 50 million, just say for the sake of argument, 50 million in parishes like mine, where our diocese isn't eligible for the link funding for lowest income communities because the rest of the diocese is reasonably wealthy. But that doesn't seem to translate into making sure every parish has a full-time priest here. you get into the numbers. I serve a parish of about 21,000 people in an area of very high deprivation on many indices. To do that 2.5 to 3 days a week is challenging. It really is challenging. A friend of mine recently moved on from a post where they had 2 full-time priests, a priest and a curate, to cover an area which had a population of 1,500. I mean, you can learn everybody's name in the entire benefits. Okay, it was spread across a few different village churches, but the actual pounds spent per head on ministry there was roughly 40 times what it is. That's not a small difference. That is injustice, in my opinion.
It is.
So I would want to push the church commissioners to say, why are we holding on to... Incidentally, the UN published a report a couple of years ago saying they could combat most of world hunger with $6 billion. Sorry. So we're sitting on a pot of money that's significant enough to make a major dent in hunger across the world. And yet we're not investing it even in our own ministry, never mind anything else. To me, I'm sorry, I'm probably saying something that's going to land me in hot water. That is fundamentally unjust and it needs to change. Otherwise, what profit it a man to gain the whole world but lose or forfeit his very self? Yeah, what is the point in having all that money?
Yeah, quite often, look, people who dish out the money, they want to know what the return is, don't they? They want to know.
Of course they do. They want to count it in.
What's in it for me? And you know, when I started on General Synod 18 months ago and listened to the President's address, you know, telling us that church attendance is now approaching 1%. You think, well, whatever you've been doing or wherever your money has been going, it's clearly not working.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you hold the same view as me, Luke. You know, I absolutely believe that the growth of the church is in the margins. It is in the working class environments. It is in the working class parishes, because particularly at this time of crisis that we've been all living through, is that people are seeking something, aren't they? Or something's not quite right with their life. They perhaps can't put their finger on it. And I think in our context, you know, St. Matt's has become a bit of a haven. It's become a bit of a safe place. It's become a place where people are judged and people can just be what they want to be, and not too much expectation at this point. Obviously, the challenges that moves on is how you progress them into be living Christians, living out their daily lives, you know. But it's But I do absolutely believe that if we invest in our most deprived parishes, the payoff might not necessarily be monetary, but it will be extremely valuable in disciples.
And it's just the right thing to do. You know, the lectionary passage for this Sunday talks about a rich man storing up all his grain in storehouses, thinking, oh, well, I'll be secure for the future. I mean, what an allegory for how we use our money in the Church of England that is. You know, it is a perfect allegory of storing up all this wealth for what, when we should be investing it. So I think Al Barrett and Ruth Harley use some really interesting language around this in their book, Being Interrupted. And they talk about this sort of 2 models they talk about for the use of resources in churches. One, they call it counting in. So counting in is sort of putting a price on souls. So it's like, if I give you a £10,000 grant, I want at least 20 extra people to start coming to your church or whatever. There's another kind of counting which is better in my view, which is counting out. So it would be more like, well, if we give you 10 grand, I want you to have started a food bank that's doled out this number of food parcels. I mean, at least that's a little bit less selfish, right? But they talk about what the church really needs is to be interrupted and to stop counting people in that way, because otherwise people's souls start to become a commodity, which is really worrying and dehumanizing to me. So to go on a bit of a weird metaphor here or comparison, so bear with me. During the Vietnam War, when things were not going so well, the US government hired a guy called McNamara, who ran the production line at the Ford Motor Company. And he was like an expert in productivity, basically, and measurement. And they thought by hiring this guy, he would make the war effort so productive and so efficient that it would turn the tides around. And so he brought in all these measurements for how they were going to measure what they were doing. And the people on the front lines, the sergeants and that, were saying, all we're doing now is spending all our time measuring all this stuff. and actually none of it matters. So even though on paper what they were doing was meeting his measurements, the war effort went down the toilet. Not that I support the Vietnam War, but I think we do something similar in the church, where there's an old phrase a mate of mine uses, which is that if you don't measure what counts, then what you measure becomes what counts. So if we start measuring things that don't really matter, all our energy and focus goes on doing things that don't really matter.
Yeah.
So we need to really, I think, regain our soul and be re-evangelized by Jesus of Nazareth in the church to say, what actually matters?
Yeah.
What are we doing? What is this all for? What
Yeah.
are we going to leave as our legacy? What are we going to spend our time and our money on?
I think that, Luke, is so important for people to hear. I left the world of retail. I worked for Argos for 20 years, and my whole life was around measures. It was around key performance indicators.
Yeah, KPIs. Yeah.
What your sales were, what your financial services were, what your health is. So, and I didn't leave the church to do that. Leave Argos to do that in the church. And when we were fortunate, I say fortunate, we've got associate priest with us that's being funded. But even with that, people want to know, what's the return? How many more bums on seats will you be? What kind of I remember somebody said, do you think the people might give on your estate might give £5 a week? I was like, you're having a joke. You haven't got a clue. They come, and quite often they can't give anything, and if anything they take, whether it's a food parcel or a meal, but that is that's the gospel of Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah. And
at some point the church needs to acknowledge that and respond to it in a way. We have to beg, borrow, and steal most of the time, and it feels unfair. It feels unfair, really.
I mean, when you serve a parish like that, and you have to sit through a very well-meaning presentation on increasing your parish giving by getting a contactless card machine and things like that, I have to try very hard not to burst a blood vessel when I have to sit and listen, as if the narrative is, if you just did your job a little bit better, then you'd get a bit more money in and you'd be all right. That makes me furious, to be honest. That's not the person that's saying it. That's their job to do that. It's nothing against them, but it's a narrative and it's a model of economics which we need to come away from as the church. To quote Bono, which is something I seem to be in a terrible habit of doing recently, because he's an interesting character. He famously sang, "The God I believe in isn't short of cash," and neither, in fact, is the Church of England short of cash either. No. So, to me, where I am, the best that the church commissioners have to offer us is a discount on a card reader when they're making £1 billion a year. That's offensive to me. It really is offensive.
Yeah. And people in the estates and the working classes wonder why we do it, Yeah. When you say, I've got to pay whatever it is, 15, 20, 30 grand, what? Where do you get your money from? We get it from you guys, But I think your point again is really important, priests and church teams are working their butts off on these environments, in these settings,
and it comes at a massive personal cost, doesn't it? Let's be honest.
Tell me about it, mate.
It's not easy being a priest anywhere because of what you hear and what you see, but the level of pain and injustice. I got to the point of having to ask some serious questions about what I believed after some of the things that I started to see. The unjust and unfair suffering that people who don't deserve it go through. And I'd come from quite a sort of reformed theological background. And I had to say to myself, to be really blunt with you, Alex, if God has chosen for things to be this way, then God can fuck off. I'm not worshipping that guy, But if the God I believe in is somehow in some mysterious way I don't really understand, trying to lead us to come together and struggle for a better world, that's something I want to be part of.
Luke, you're touching on my buttons because people will be surprised at that language, but I'm not surprised at that language because that's how I think. I think, and I think the Church of England does that to you. It's like I kind of think, ultimately, I work for Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah.
I'm just happen to be paid by the Church of England and live in one of their houses.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
But
And you know what? Yeah, like you said earlier, Alex, I don't want to just sit here and beat up the Church of England, because I've met so many lovely people. I'm really grateful. You know, I've got a fantastic Suffragan bishop here, Bishop of Bedford, who's a real supporter of a lot of the justice work that we're trying to do. I've met so many wonderful, kind people from all sorts of backgrounds. But we have to say at some point that as an institution, our culture is sick. You know, that's nothing against individuals within that institution, but I would say institutionally, we are part of a sick culture. The whole Queen Anne's Bounty episode demonstrates that we're holding on to this money, a large part of which came from the transatlantic slave trade. These are riches which came from injustice, and yet they're being greedily hoarded and not given away. How you can justify that is...
Do you know what, Luke? I try and keep these podcasts to half an hour and we're 40 minutes in, but it's fascinating. It's fascinating stuff, because what you say there, I think, is really interesting. You know, I sometimes think, you know, the people in power are afraid to give some of that power away, because actually it's a kick up the arse for them to recognise that somebody else and somebody from a working class background might actually be able to do it better. You know,
and for all of us, that's the call in our own ways. You know, I recognise that despite my class background, I do have some privilege that comes from my gender, my ethnicity, and other things. But ultimately, what does Christ call us to? And if we're running over time, here might be a good place to stop. In Philippians chapter 2, the writer says, if you've got any consolation in Christ, if you want to in any way respond faithfully to this gospel, be like me, be of the same mind of Christ Jesus. And then he then goes on, or they then go on to recite a hymn, what's thought to be one of the earliest hymns or doctrologies or creeds of the early church, which tells us that Christ did not consider equality with God something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant. And that is what God is calling the Church of England to do. God is saying, the Holy Spirit is whispering to the Church of England today, if you have any consolation in Christ, then be of the same mind of Christ Jesus, who emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant, pouring out his life for others, not building crosses, but bearing crosses, not building crosses for the poor, for the LGBTQ community, for people from majority world heritages, for the planet we even live on that is suffering under this current system that we live in, but bearing that cross in solidarity with those who suffer. That's the Jesus I worship. That's the spirit I try in my own failing way to follow, getting it wrong every day. That is what I believe the Spirit is calling the Church of England to today. You can call me idealistic or utopian if you want, that's fine. But I, for one, intend to roll up my sleeves and get my hands dirty for as many years as I've got. Yeah,
amen to that, Luke. Absolutely. Luke, I was going to talk to you about your book. Do you want to plug your book? It's out there.
Yeah, fine. It's out there. SCM Press, Confounding the Mighty. I never made much money as a bricklayer because I'm not very good at selling myself. So, yeah, it's out there. Check it out. What I would say, it's an edited volume. There's 7 other people that contribute to it, plus a brilliant foreword by Anthony Reddy and a brilliant afterword by Professor Jörg from Vanderbilt. And big congratulations to Professor Anthony, now a Professor of Black Theology for the first time at Oxford University. Those stories need to be heard, because not all of the people that contribute to that are professors. Some of them are people who've never been published before, and their voices are important, talking about their struggles as working class people related to their gender, to their ethnicity, to struggles like caste, all kinds of stuff. So please do check it out for the sake of those voices that need to be heard.
Yeah, cheers, Luke. And just quickly, I mean, you come across as a very humane man with a lot of humanity. What do you like to do when you're not studying the gospel and teaching and learning? What you like? I guess you like your music. You mentioned Bono.
Yeah, there's 2 things I like to do, and both involve being outside. I haven't been a brickie for 10 years. I struggle being indoors too much.
Yeah.
If I'm feeling tired, I go and potter around in the vicarage garden. It's shown me what access to a bit of land can do for you. You know, we've got a nice garden here with lots of trees and plants. It's been amazing talking to the birds. And then secondly, when I'm feeling a bit more energetic, I'll get out on a local river kayaking, watching the bats and the kingfishers and having a laugh with my mates, get my pulse running a bit.
Fabulous. Well, Luke, it's been great. And everybody who might be listening, or watching this on YouTube, thanks for checking us out. You can find loads of interviews like this with theologians, with musicians, all sorts of people. Just check out the Godcast, and if you enjoy this interview, perhaps subscribe to us as well. So, Luke, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. We send our love to you.
Thank you, Alex.
Down the M6, is it M1 down to Bedford?
Yeah. Down. Anytime you're in Luton, drop by and I'll make you a cup of tea.
Cheers, mate. Thanks again.
All the best. Ta-ra now.
Well, hi everyone, Father Alex here. I'm the Vicar of St Matthew's Church in Burnley. I'm also the host of the Godcast, which hopefully you're going to watch now. I'm also the author of Our Daily Bread, Argos to the Altar, pre-story, which is out now, so go check that out. I do hope you enjoy this interview that's coming up now with Luke Larner, who is a priest specialising in practical theology. And this conversation focuses on the issue of class between the church and the challenges and the compromises that brings to us in the Church of England. If you enjoy this video, do check out others, or perhaps subscribe down in the bottom right-hand corner. There are over 140 interviews now, I think, of Godcast guests, so plenty to look at and something for everyone. So thanks for watching, and hope you enjoy this interview now with Luke Larner.